Hey everyone, welcome to Action Cut and Everything in Between, episode number 8. Today I'm talking with Joseph Narai. He is a sound guru and he's going to talk about the power of sound and the effect that it has on your films. It plays a huge part in your filmmaking and it's not something that you can just skip over and worry about later. You need to have decent sound on your set. So let's jump right in.
Welcome to Action Cut and Everything in Between. A comprehensive guide to shooting a feature film, all on your own.
All right then, Joe, how are you, mate?
Not too bad, thank you.
Good. Welcome to the show. Thanks for giving up your time. I know you're flat out at the moment. What are you working on?
We're actually designing some new audio equipment for safety monitoring for orchestras.
Okay.
Doesn't sound very exciting, but it actually is really important. Yeah, it prevents hearing loss and makes sure that orchestra musicians are playing in a safe environment.
That's cool.
Pretty cool.
That's awesome. So with you being a sound guru, this should pretty much be the best sounding podcast I've ever done. So no pressure.
Oh yeah, okay. Let's hope, huh? Let's hope it works.
Let's hope the studio mic's up to it.
Yeah.
You sound good so far.
All right, good.
So what's your background then? How did you actually get into sound?
So basically high school muso, played in a band, and pretty much from an early age was just obsessed with recording things. So, composing music and playing stuff. So first recordings were 4-track recorder on a cassette way back in the early 80s. And so I kind of just got obsessed with audio from there. So I made my own studio. So I was recording bands and not live music, but just demo tapes, that sort of stuff. And I was running that commercially for a while I was doing my uni course. Then after I finished my course, I actually did an audio engineering course as well. So I did a course in physics, laser physics, nothing to do with audio or music or any of that stuff. But really enjoyed the music. So I spent a year doing an audio engineering course, made the studio, ran that commercially for a bit. Then I ran into a guy who was designing this bit of digital hardware. This was way back, like I said, early 90s, I guess it was. And so, studios were very much tape machines. There was no digital recorders, or I think DAT had just come out, digital audio recorders on tape, And he designed this card that could go into a PC that you could kind of record audio through, and it was like, okay, this is interesting, and he needed some software to develop it. And I'd never studied software, but I'd been working on in my own studio doing a sequencer for recording MIDI, recording music and stuff. And so I started working on the software from there, and I kind of got sucked into it. And we developed one of the world's first computer-based digital audio recorders. And kind of that began my foray into post-production, because that was really they were the people who had the money to buy expensive gear. And so we developed first a 2-track, then an 8-track, and then 16 and 32-track digital recorder. And we then incorporated touchscreen control mixing into that and non-linear video playback. So these are all things that we all take for granted now in Final Cut and DaVinci Resolve and all of that. But we were one of the first people in the world first companies in the world to develop it way back in the early 90s. And as part of that, I did some short films and started doing sound for short films and sort of got into the sound side. And I was always fascinated as to what we could do in terms of making the post-production process more efficient and easier for audio guys like me to make good sounding film.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you've actually, you've been there through the whole kind of evolution, haven't you, of this sound into the digital scape and all that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's evolved through my working career. Like I said, we started with 8-track reel-to-reel tape machines, and we were actually developing the products to for post-production studios to do their work on. So my company was called DSP. And it's funny because, just a bit of history, there were two Australian companies, Fairlight and DSP, that were basically out in the world competing, making digital audio recording equipment, and for specifically for post-production of film. And so Australia really punched above its weight, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great. So where do you think it's heading to next then? Kind of sound. What's on the horizon?
So my new company is basically kind of looking at exactly that question. And one of the primary things that is really kind of taking off at the moment is immersive audio. And now we've known about that kind of in film with Dolby Atmos and, Dolby Surround and all of that sort of stuff. But immersive audio is really even more speakers. So, live installations where you've just got speakers all around you, up above on the ceiling, down below you, in the seats, and all of that sort of stuff. And really the traditional way of doing audio, like you kind of do in Resolve or Pro Tools or whatever, is all track and channel based. And it's kind of not really what immersive audio is about. It's really more about objects. You take things and you can throw them around the room and that kind of stuff. So we're looking at basically reinventing how that works, based on kind of modern, both computing practices, but also physical, we're looking at how you can control the sound in a physical space. So that's pretty cool. In terms of location sound for film recording, nothing too much has changed there. The recorders are getting smaller and smaller, which is fantastic, and the mic technology is getting smaller and smaller, which means you can hide lapels everywhere and that kind of thing, which makes things easier.
Yeah, that's cool. We'll probably look back 20 years' time at sound and we'll be like, oh, it used to sound so flat and all that. Now it's like everywhere, buzzing around our heads.
Everywhere, that's it. Yeah, exactly. And that's it's obviously been really, really good with Dolby Atmos and the current cinematic formats, but they're all changing as well, and there are different ways to do, to process that sound and make it even more realistic, and things like immersive headphones where you can actually have a surround mix in a normal pair of headphones. As you turn your head, it tracks you, and that really means that you can get into that space of personalized stuff. That applies, I guess, probably more to virtual reality, like VR recordings and stuff, but I think it's all really quite interesting at the moment. It all feels quite new, which is pretty exciting, actually.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. All right. So I've been guilty of this, especially when I was first starting out as an indie filmmaker, is not really taking sound too seriously, and it's always a bit of an afterthought.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell people
tend
about
to do that.
the importance of sound and how much it plays a part in filmmaking?
Yeah. My favorite example, and I can't remember who it was. It was one of the major Hollywood producers, and they talked about this was at a conference, and they talked about how they did a screening test, and they just to kind of work out how important sound was, and they did 2 screenings for 2 test audiences of exactly the same film, but one of them had no Foley. So Foley, for those who don't know, is all the little sounds, your clothes rustling, your boots crunching on the ground as you walk, all of those sort of little tiny, incidental sounds. And you think, they're not important, right? And what was really fascinating about the survey reports of people coming out after seeing the ones that, the people that saw the film without Foley thought that the picture quality was not as good as the other one. And so they don't know what it is, and this is one of the things about it, particularly indie filmmakers, is exactly, you treat audio as an afterthought, but you don't actually realize that it's actually probably more than 50% of the experience. I mean, in reality, it's 50-50 is a nice way to look at it. But either way, if you kind of ignore that 50%, that's kind of a really important half of your film that's not there. Yeah. And just that fact that, people go, oh, that didn't look as good. It's just a really fascinating psychological thing, because it had nothing to do with how it looked. It was just that they could tell something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was, and they could only describe it by saying it didn't look as nice.
Yeah, it's incredible how much sound kind of brings the picture to life. I've been going through Saving Grace at the moment, and adding in all the footsteps and stuff at the moment to try and make your life easier, and even just the nice little creaky floorboards and things like that just really kind of brings it alive.
Absolutely, and it's really important, those little details. You think, and in fact, when I mix them, you hardly hear them, but if they're not there, you can tell they're missing. It's one of those really weird things that unless those little tiny sounds are there, something's wrong, and it just doesn't feel real. And filmmaking is all about immersing the audience member, the viewer, in this real world. And if little things are missing, it's just off, and it takes them out of the experience. It takes you out of the film, and you lose your disbelief, right? Because you got to suspend your disbelief to pretend you're in there.
Yeah.
So all those little things are important. And the other really important thing in that is in your comment is the creakiness and those little tiny things. They're the things that bring the space to life, and the little background noises, the little things that you may have a little visual cue, like maybe there's a little light flickering or something, and it's like, okay, well, what causes that visual light flicker? There should be a sound in there, even if in reality there isn't one. But your eyes your brain puts those things together, and if you hear a little flicker that's in a little flickery sound that's in time with that little flickery vision on the screen, it ties it together, and your brain goes, oh, it's real. I'm there. So it's all about the art of illusion.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. I've always found that soundies are pretty hard to come by as well. I don't know whether that's just kind of in Sydney or what. I don't actually know what the kind of stats are with people who are studying sound. Do you think that it kind of doesn't have the same kind of cool reputation as kind of, I'm a camera guy or something like that? If someone just turns around and they say, I do sound, I stand there with headphones and a boom, kind of like, it doesn't have this side to, I don't know, but I think it's so important. But
I think you're probably right. Yeah, it's not as romanticized as the other aspects of filmmaking, I guess. But kind of like you said, as a filmmaker, if you're approaching it from a visual point of view, it's kind of also a lot of the time an afterthought. It's like, and so maybe it's the same. I'm not really sure why that is. I think you're right, but I don't really know why.
Yeah. I think it just doesn't have the glamour, does it? You just think, I just stand there with a mic and headphones, and it's like, no, it's kind of so much more than that.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it depends on. I mean, because I do both ends. I know what I'm going to record for myself when I'm mixing it. But it's just so important to really capture as pristine a sound as you can on location. And a lot of times you can't. If you're in a noisy location, you just got to get what you can, and then you got to try to fix it up in post-production. But the more you have to fix up in post-production, the more it costs you. And it's one of those false economies as well, I think, and that's really important as well for an indie filmmaker to think about is, I didn't spend much money on my location sound, and therefore I've got to try to fix everything up later, and it just makes the job much, much harder. And ends up taking more time and costing more money.
Yeah, that's it. People are happy, they'll pay for the makeup artist and all this, and they might put on an expensive lunch and all this, and then, we got any money left for a sound guy? No, nothing. Okay, we'll just pass the boom to someone who's there, who's got a spare set of hands, and then, like you say, comes back to bite you in the arse later on.
Yeah, exactly, because it's then, the mic wasn't pointing at the actor's mouth, and therefore everything's sounding a bit muffled, and suddenly, how am I going to fix that? And if you can try to sweeten it as best you can from that location recording, but if the data's not there, if it's, if it was pointing in the wrong direction, then you can't really brighten it up too much without making it sound unnatural. And then you got to go voiceover, and you got to then spend the whole time in the studio, and you're trying to do automatic dialogue replacement, which is very Hollywood, but that's all budget, and if you don't have that budget, again, that all comes back to bite you.
Yeah.
But that's also typically the thing that I guess separates a professional film from an amateur film is the quality of that sound. It goes all round. It's the quality of the cinematographer and their work, but also the quality of the sound guy and their work. And if the dialogue isn't crisp and clear and easy to understand, and doesn't sound consistent from scene to scene, etc., then or heaven forbid, actually distorted or whatever, then suddenly it's a home video instead of a film. So it's a really important point, is to really capture as a good quality sound as you possibly can in the on location for every shot.
Yeah, I can pick it up instantly now if I'm kind of looking at previews of things, and it's got this amazing cinematography. But yeah, the sound is kind of just the biggest giveaway. You can just, like you say, tell that it's low budget.
That's it. Yeah, exactly.
So, if you're a beginner indie filmmaker, what's the kind of basic gear that you'd recommend for somebody to have on set?
So if you're going super low budget, then probably one of the Zoom recorders are pretty cost effective. They come in 2, 4, 8 channel versions. If you can afford an 8 channel one, that's fantastic. And at least one good quality shotgun microphone. It depends on where you're shooting. If your budget extends to it, you also want to then have a lapel microphone on each actor. But wherever possible, unless it's super noisy or super reverby, so like if you're in a big hall or something, I tend to try to use the boom recording as much as I possibly can rather than the lapel. And that's because you just kind of think about the physics of what's going on. You're making a noise that's coming out of the front of your mouth, and a lapel mic usually sits down below the chest. So you'll get some good presence. You'll get that nice, close mic'd feel, but you lose the sibilance and the top end of the microphone and the clarity of the microphone. So they sound good, but if you can get a boom mic that's pointing at somebody's lips, then that's where the sound's coming out of, and you'll get the best quality sound that you can out of it. So really, minimum kit is a good quality shotgun mic and a Zoom recorder, and you can get pretty inexpensive shotgun mics that aren't too bad. The Rode microphones are pretty good, and if you've got more money, you could then go to more expensive brands.
Yeah, that's cool. So any top tips for people to kind of get better sound? I suppose there's so many variables in that, isn't there? So what about
there are, but
yeah, go on.
Yeah, there are, but there's some pretty basics. Is you want to get your shotgun mic as close to possible to your actor's face. That's what you're trying to record. You're trying to record the voice coming out of their mouth, and you've got to kind of be the annoying sound guy who is getting the boom in shot sometimes. But I always try to establish the frame. Where's the edge of frame, and try to get that microphone in as tightly as I can. Little things like trying to point the microphone in such a way that it's not capturing too much background noise. So if you've got a shot where there's traffic going from behind the person or to a certain side, then you want to point the back of the microphone towards where that noise is coming from, even if it means capturing the sound out of the person's voice slightly off angle. But if you can it's all about reducing background noise, maximizing the sound that's coming out of their mouth. So getting it as close mic'd as you can is really important. Another simple tip, and this works well if you've got a multi-track recorder. So the Zoom 8-channel mic recorder, for example, has 8 channels, but I'm typically only use 4 inputs on indie films. I'll have the boom mic on 1 and then up to 3 lapel mics. But what it lets you do is the second set of channels, so channels 5, 6, 7, and 8, are mapped to channels 1, 2, 3, 4, but you've got a separate analog gain control on them. And so what I'll typically do there is have that gain control turned down by 6 to 12 dB. And what it means is that I'm now getting 2 tracks recorded for each of my microphones. One is what I'm hoping is going to be my optimal level for the typical voice level that the actor's going to have. But if they happen to yell or raise their voice or whatever, and it clips a little bit on my main channel, I've got a second channel that's being recorded at a lower gain, and typically that's not going to distort. And that's really important, particularly if you're kind of capturing stuff that can be a little bit variable. You know, if it's a fight scene or an argument scene or something where you don't quite know what the actor's going to do in terms of their performance. It's obviously pretty easy if you know, you're rehearsing and you know exactly what the levels are and they're consistent, then it's fantastic. But those cases where you're not quite sure what's going to happen, it's great to have that the two channels being recorded at different levels. And it's important that it's done at the analog stage. So your mic preamp has to be turned down for that second channel, so that you're not, because typically that's what'll distort is you'll clip your mic pre. And so you want to have that analog level turned down.
Yeah, very good.
So that's probably one of the most important tips if you've got the gear that can do it. Now, if you don't have the gear that can do it, you've got to be a bit conservative, and that's one of those things where you'll have to take a punt and get your level as close as you can to what you think it will be. If it does clip, it's really important to tell the director that take clipped. I'm going to have to turn it down. Let's do it again and do a second take, because the last thing you want is to have a word that's distorted and you can't really recover from that too well. You can do some restoration depending on the tools that your post-production guy has, but it becomes pretty tricky.
Would you manually turn down then at that point? So if you know that say argument is about to kick off,
yep,
you'll then just dial down at that point.
Exactly, yeah. And there's a couple of techniques you can use. You can either dial down and the whole thing goes a bit soft, and that becomes tricky if there's soft dialogue and loud dialogue in the same thing, which is why the two channels work the best. But in those cases, then the other thing you can do as a soundy as a boom operator is actually move the boom further away when they're going to do the loud sound. Now, that may give you a bit more room and change the tone, but at least you've got something that's not distorted. And the last one you've got, if you've got if you're lucky enough to have a sound assistant, which generally you don't on a indie, low budget feature, but it's a bit like a focus puller. You'd have someone that would actually turn down the analog gain at the point at which you know they're going to be louder, and that again is a really nice way to do it.
Yeah, nice. Is there any advantages, no disadvantages to boom over and boom under, or is it that just kind of relates to the frame, what's happening?
It usually relates to the frame. I personally prefer boom under wherever I can, but you've got to be careful that you're not got reflections and sound reverberation from the ceilings when you do that, which is why you tend to indoors do a boom down, because you're then going to get the floor and there's more stuff on the floor, so you get less reflections and reverb reverb sounds coming off it. Whereas if you're hitting up on the ceiling, you're generally going to have a nice clean flat surface, so it'll actually reflect more. But yeah, generally it's really what's in frame, and the other thing obviously as a boom operator is you've got to keep out of the light, so you've got to be aware that, you know, if I put the boom in from this angle, I'm going to cast a shadow on their face or on the background behind them or on the wall beside them or whatever it is. And if that's in shot, then, you know, the last thing you want to see is this boom shadow moving around the frame.
That's it. This is why filmmaking always takes so much longer than you think, isn't it? Because you're all ready to shoot get ready, right? Okay, ready to roll. Oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
Shadow on the face. That's
it. Exactly. Boom. Yeah. And as the soundy, especially if you're doing any outdoor sort of stuff, then it's always, here comes an aeroplane, there's a car, there's a chainsaw, there's something else going on.
Yeah, that's it.
And that always ends up taking forever.
It's always silent, isn't it, all day? And then as soon as we're ready for the take, it's like you're on the flight path.
Exactly, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're working on Guilt at the moment as well, I think. Guilt we've spoken about in the previous podcasts with Carl and with Lindsay. So I think you're doing the sound for that, aren't you? How's that all going?
Well, we've just gone picture lock, which is pretty good. And Carl has transferred all of the dialogue tracks over, and I'm about to start the dialogue cleanup. So it's early days, but we've just started now. Yeah, looking forward to actually getting into it.
Yeah, nice. So what's next for you? I know you said at the beginning that you are working on that new tech, and also working on Guilt. Anything else on the horizon? Anything else you want to add?
We're talking with a writer-director called Susie McKay, who's looking at shooting a indie feature in Papua New Guinea, which is quite an interesting one. on one of the remote islands with not much electricity or anything else. So that's potentially going to be a very interesting shoot. But, that's what filmmaking is all about, right? Especially when you get to go to interesting places and see different cultures and that sort of stuff. It's a really nice opportunity.
Yeah, you might need an extra suitcase just full of AA batteries.
Yeah, well, that's right, especially for the recorders.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to all be about battery management and time management and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting process.
Yeah, that's cool. Well,
and staying out of the heat and not getting malaria.
Oh, do they have malaria there?
Yes, they do. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good luck with all that. I hope that all pans out and you make it through okay.
So do I. I think it's going to be a fun project. And not sure what else. We're kind of brewing on some ideas, and we'll see what else comes out in the new year.
Hopefully you've got some time to work on my films as well. That'd be nice.
Oh yeah, well that's right. That is my other two things. As soon as I finish Guilt, absolutely.
Yeah, they're almost there. So trying to get screeners ready for AFM. That's kind of my deadline at the moment. So hopefully you can fit me in the next couple of months before that all happens. And are you gonna head to AFM this year?
I hope so, actually. Yeah. We're starting to talk to some distributors about Guilt, which is pretty exciting. And sort of gearing ourselves up for how we're going to sell it and market it and all that sort of stuff. So learning a lot about an area. So this is with my producer hat on as opposed to my soundy hat on. But yeah, it's fun.
Maybe you'll take like a mini recorder with you and just picking up sounds while you're there in LA and stuff like that.
Yeah, I do enjoy doing that when I get a chance. It's fun going out into the wilderness and picking up sounds. So, but a network of soundies as well around the world that I know from previous lives of my other products and all that. And a lot of them live in different locations. So if you need a sound for something, you can reach out to the network and see what they can find for you.
Yeah, nice, cool.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Joe, this has been awesome. I've learned so much myself. Like so much that you don't even think about with sound.
Yeah. And there's a whole other process. I don't know if you want to cover it in a different podcast or whatever, but the whole post-production process is another interesting thing. And again, it's another place where sound typically gets left till last and there's no budget left for it. And it's, again, a really important aspect of it. So, you got the two sides, just like you do on the visuals. You've got your actual cinematography on location, but then you've got the whole edit and the grading and all of those important things at the end. And even in big budget feature films, sound always gets left till last. And, the big studios have got 2 weeks to get the sound finished, and it's like, nearly impossible. So there's some tips and tricks there too that might be of interest if you wanted to talk about that at some point.
So sound post-production, what's the kind of process that happens on that then?
Yeah, well, obviously the most important thing that's still the trickiest to know, there are a few solutions out there, but they're not really very good. The most important thing is getting picture lock before you actually start on sound, because you can end up spending a lot of time cleaning stuff up, fixing things, getting sound ready, and then somebody chops out an entire scene or moves it around or shuffles it, and then getting that synchronized between your video editor and your audio editor is still really difficult. Even after all these years, it's been one of the bane of every audio guy's life, post-production guy's life. So you've got to make sure that you've got picture lock before you start in earnest on the actual production. But having said that, there's a big job in doing the stuff that you're doing right now, is finding the types of sounds that you want for footsteps, for sounds, for atmosses, for sound effects and things that you're going to need. If you've got an axe chopping into a bit of wood scene, then you can go and try to find some sounds. And if you don't have them in your library, you can then get your soundy to try to record some stuff if you've got a location guy that can do it. So getting prepared. And I guess from an indie point of view, budget for some kind of sound effects can be cost prohibitive if you don't have a sound guy that's got a library of their own. There's a network and there are a lot of free sound library places out there, but sometimes you got to just do some Foley. Again, get a microphone, close mic the sound as best you can and try to put it together. But also remember that things aren't necessarily what they appear to be. So sounds don't have to be made by the thing that makes them. A really good example is a broken bone or a head crunch or that sort of thing can easily be done with a stick of celery and some other bits and pieces that don't sound or look anything like the original thing. Well, actually, they do sound like the original thing. In fact, sometimes they sound more like the original thing than the original thing is. My favourite example of that's probably a clip I saw of rain sound effects. So, the visuals was some rain falling down pretty heavily, and the sound was made by bacon sizzling on a pan. And it sounded more like the rain did than the actual original rain recording did. So it's one of those things that sound can tend to amplify, the reality, if you like, make something sound more real or more intense or more ghastly or whatever the effect is that you're going for than the original thing did. So, if you've got a good sound guy, they'll play around with that sort of stuff and really be able to be creative on that area, even if they don't have the sound of the original thing that you're trying to produce.
Yeah, and stabbing a watermelon is always a good one. Gives you some nice,
exactly.
Nice flesh.
That's it. Yeah, yeah, that's it. And so there's lots of ways to put together sounds. And again, as an indie filmmaker, if you've got time, if you're inclined to get into that, then there are some reasonably inexpensive or free programs around to use. Pro Tools is obviously the ubiquitous post-production tool, but there are free programs like Reaper and there's a few others that are available that work just fine, and they're shareware or freeware, and they've got all the features of the larger systems. They're a little clunkier to use, but they still work, and they do an adequate job of allowing you to do it on a low budget. But again, if you can afford it, get a sound guy to actually, who's done post-production, and make sure you listen to some of the previous work that they've done and that you like the quality of what they've created for the kind of budget that you've got. It's all about matching your budget. And in our case, we do a lot of quick pro-quos for each other, and that's another way to do it is, if they've got projects that they want to do the visuals on and you're not an audio guy and vice versa, then you can form partnerships to do stuff together, which is pretty cool. What else is important on the post-production side? For me, clarity of dialogue is just absolutely number one. So you want to make sure you get as clean a dialogue track as you can from your location recorder, and then do as much as you can in post-production to keep it sounding natural and clean. And sometimes that's difficult, but there's a great set of programs, and it's not cheap. It's called iZotope, 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 and it's the RX product. Hang on, I'm just trying to find the name of it. RX7 it is at the moment, and it's got some absolutely incredible noise reduction, and basically low-level audio tools. A really good example of how useful something like that is we did a film called Bonnets and Breeches. Again, I did that with Carl, and we shot it in the Australian countryside, as we've done with a lot of your stuff. And there's these kookaburras that are and cockatoos that are making these terrible screeching noises and things right in the middle of a take. And the iZotope tools allow you to see them. You can actually see a spectrograph of those against time and draw a little circle around them and literally delete the little tiny squawk out of the thing without affecting your audio much at all. And they've got some general dialogue isolation tools which are absolutely fantastic. So that same film we did next to a main road, and there were cars going past pretty regularly, and the dialogue isolate basically cleaned that up really, really nicely. And it's always a compromise between how clean it becomes, and if you use them too heavily, you can hear artifacts, and it starts to affect how the actual voice sounds. So it's always that balance. So it's important not to go overboard and clean them up too much, because if you're just listening to dialogue, you can want to clean it up too much, and then when you mix it back in with everything else, it doesn't need to actually be as clean as you think it might need to be, because in the rest of the soundtrack you're going to have music, you're going to have an atmosphere, some background noises, and so then it can be blended in with that background noise without going too far. But yeah, clear dialogue that you can actually hear, and making sure that it's not too loud, not too soft, and all of that sort of Goldilocks kind of stuff. And it's one of those things where, as I said, it's really good to have a professional sounding on board. But if you can't do it yourself, then if you can't afford that, then you need to do it yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, that the isotope thing, because on Saving Grace, I know there was kind of some speedboats that kept going past during one of my takes.
Yep.
They were only kind of in the distance, but you can hear them there. So
yep.
I thought I may have to do ADR, but it sounds there could be a chance that you could actually clean that up.
Yeah, very, very possibly you can. Yeah, that's right. So as I said, isotope is a great set of tools. It's expensive. It's like $1,500, I think, for the set. But if you're doing sound and you're doing that work all the time, then it's really, really, it's money well worth spending.
So with the music, how do you
Mm-hmm.
get that balance between kind of the levels of the music and the levels of the sound effects?
Yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those judgment calls. I mean, as a mixer, I mentioned before, dialogue is paramount. So whenever anybody's talking, it's got to be clear and able to be heard. So if the music is too loud, it's going to and it's drowning things out, then it's you've obviously got to keep the music down. In terms of balance of the music versus sound effects and the rest of the soundtrack that's going on, that's kind of a little trickier, because that can be very stylistic depending on what you're going for. And there are many instances where you want to sort of bring the music in and out so that it's kind of hardly there or suddenly very noticeable, but that becomes a stylistic choice as opposed to a naturalistic choice, because really, there is no music in life as you as you watch something. So it's kind of a very much an artificial construct, but it's also one of the really important things in terms of getting the emotion right in a scene. The right piece of music at the right moment in a scene can completely change the way it feels and the way it impacts the audience. So it's one of those ones that I don't think I can answer for you really, other than saying that it's just got to feel right. And if you're an indie filmmaker that doesn't have a budget and you're trying to do this yourself, it's very much trial and error. So you've really got to just kind of make the changes in those levels and just listen to it and see if you can get it to a point that feels right. And for a lot of people, especially if you don't know much about audio, that's really challenging, because you're kind of flying blind a little bit. You don't really know what's wrong when it doesn't feel right. So the only way really to do that is to either, get somebody who knows what they're doing, or just a lot of trial and error, experimentation and perseverance, because, it takes time. You just got to keep trying it, keep, changing little things and trying to see, okay, how does this sound if all of the music is just 6 dB lower here? Does it feel any different or whatever? Just bring it down a little bit, push it up a little bit. And then don't be afraid also to ride those levels, to actually control the sound of the mix over time and bring the music in or bring it down as you need to. So it all comes down to feel more than anything else. That one's tricky. There isn't really a technical answer to that one, I don't think.
Yeah, okay. That's fair enough. Yeah, good.
Yeah.
So what would you say your favorite sounding film of all time is? Do you have one?
Oh,
you just
boy.
listen to it and it's like an eargasm when you watch it.
Oh man, that's hard. That's really tricky. I don't know if I've got one that see. The thing about good sound is actually when you come out of a film and you didn't notice anything. That's actually the mark of a really good soundtrack. So it's kind of one of those things that you don't actually want anybody to notice the sound ever, because generally if they've noticed something, it's probably not good.
Yeah.
But it's also probably taken you out of the film, because the whole point of the soundtrack is to keep you immersed in the film, and you come out the other end going, oh, I've come out. I guess a really good example is just recent is Stranger Things. The whole series is fantastic, but we recently binge watched Stranger Things 3, and that was just a ride all the way through. And there was never a point at which anything felt out of place or stood out. It was just, perfectly. I was perfectly immersed in the experience for the entire time, and that's what you want to go for. So it's really hard because once you start listening to what's a good soundtrack. I mean, there's two different ways of listening, right? If I'm listening as an audio professional, then I'm not watching the film. I'm actually trying to identify things. Yeah. But as a participant, you just want to be lost in the moment and not come out. And so, I think that's also a really good test for you when you've done your mix and made your film. If there's any points at which you feel like you've come out of it, you've come out of that moment. You've got to figure out why. And that could be a visual thing. It could be an editing thing. I know that when we watched one of the earlier edits of Guilt, we did a small viewing with me and my wife and Carl, and we were kind of looking through it. And I think there were 2 or 3 moments that my wife picked up on that neither Carl or I saw. And then when we went back to watch it and analyze it, we figured, it was actually one scene was just one of the shots needed to be extended by a couple of seconds, and it just changed the rhythm of that scene completely. And it wasn't even anything. It was just literally Jessie, watching the television for a second. But it was just a little too short. And as soon as she watched it a little longer, it felt like it was long enough for her to watch it and want to change the channel. Whereas in the original edit, it felt like it was just there as a cue to get into the next scene, right? So it's that little, and that was the case of an edit that needed to be a bit longer. But the same thing can happen with a voice or the sound of something being too loud or too soft, or the music not being quite right. If something like that pulls you out of the scene and you're no longer immersed in the story, then you've got to have a look at something there, and it could be sound, could be picture, could be anything. But that's a good mark for me of whether it's a good soundtrack. Yeah.
Yeah. And the sound can really help transition between scenes as well, can't it? Because I know I've got like hard cuts in mine, and I'm kind of like, oh, it feels like such a jump. And then the next minute you put your sounds in there, and the sound helps that transition, and then suddenly it just works and flows. That's it, yeah. And that could be anything from a sound effect to a piece of music to just the atmospheres, of transitioning between or fading between those two, and suddenly it feels better, So there's lots of different ways you can do that, but yeah, it's definitely really important. Yeah, nice. Well, listen, Joe, this has been so good, and cool. I hope people have taken a lot away from it. Thanks for giving your time. I appreciate it. Pleasure. Yeah, really good. Yeah, and just remember, everyone, don't scrimp on your sound, because it's 50% of your film, and if you try and save costs by not doing good sound on set, then it's going to cost you even more later on. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. All right, then. Thanks, mate, and hopefully I'll see you at AFM. Yeah, great. Talk soon. Thanks, Joe. See you, mate. See ya. Bye. Bye. As always, thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate any comments, likes, and please don't forget to subscribe. If you have any questions or topics that you'd like me to speak about, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. I want to give good content to you all, and hope that this is providing a good platform for you all to make your films even better. Thank you, and I'll see you on the next podcast. Action, cut, and everything in between. A comprehensive guide to shooting a feature film, all on your own.